All right. I think we should start. And well, first, I just want to say hi to everybody. Great to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. I'm David Gersten, the director of Arts, Letters, and Numbers. And I want to welcome you all. And I want to welcome my dear friends, Michael Benson, Chris Rose, and Andreas Mershin. And I really want to thank the three of you for bringing these conversations to our SunShip exhibition, which is part of the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale. And so I'm going to briefly introduce Michael, Chris, and Andreas, and then offer a few thoughts, and then we'll start. So I'm actually going to start with a couple of facts. I want to start with Michael Benson. Michael's work focuses on the intersection of art and science. He's a writer and artist. And in the last decade, Michael has staged a series of large-scale shows of reprocessed planetary landscape photography in major museums internationally. He's written many, many books, incredible books. And his last book, Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece, was published by Simon & Schuster on the 50th anniversary of the release of 2001: A Space Odyssey in April 2018. Michael has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, among many other publications. He's currently using scanning electron microscopes to focus on natural design at sub-millimeter scales for a project titled Nanocosmos. Michael is a fellow of the New York Institute of the Humanities and a recent visiting scholar at the MIT Media Lab. Michael is also a founding board member of Arts, Letters, and Numbers, and a longtime visiting artist. He has been coming here and changing our worldview many times over. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Andreas Mershin is the research scientist at the MIT Center for Bits and Atoms, where he directs the label-free research group in blissful ignorance of field boundaries between theoretical sciences and technology development. He teaches MIT courses on physics, machine and biological olfaction, mycotenture, and extreme biomaterials. He is also an instructor at MIT Sloan Executive Education, having developed the Lab to Market the MIT Way course, and is co-founder of startups Ninurta, Broad Spectrum Electromeridian Handheld Diagnostic, and Scientian, artificial dog intelligence sniffing out prostate cancer. I'm going to repeat that. Artificial dog intelligence sniffing out prostate cancer. He's also the president of the nonprofit Osmocosis Foundation. Totally messed that one up. Aimed at developing standards for ethical use of scent phones. Scent phones. And Chris Rose. Chris Rose is a designer and a fellow of the Royal Society of Art, London. He invented and ran the Biodesign Studio class for grad students at the Nature Lab at RISD, where he also taught furniture and architectural design and served as the acting dean of grad studies, which is when we met about 15 years ago. His interest in imaging ideas connects the work of Andreas and Michael together at differing scales and times. Chris is a member of Arts, Letters, and Numbers Advisory Council and a longtime visiting artist, bringing shocking, deep knowledge to ALN, and I would say with the greatest grace and calm. So, thank you all. It is wonderful to have you here. And this is the first of a three-part series of conversations. Tonight is titled Paradoxing, and it's going to be sort of led by Andreas and Chris. Tomorrow night is titled Futuring End 2021, A Space Odyssey. And that will be sort of led by Michael and Chris. And then Friday night is titled Architecture of Scale. And that'll be a sort of free-for-all with the three of them, and I might even chime in. I want to quick point out that people should register for each of these separately, because it seems like some people registered for the first one, and we want to make sure that they register for all of them. So I just wanted to say that I am really deeply moved to have my dear friends, truly remarkable minds, coming together for this series. You know, when we opened this SunShip exhibition, one of the primary hopes of the sort of, I would say, the overall project of this is to broaden the spectrum and increase the depth of experiences. I'm talking about of experience itself that is understood as education. Right? What's the nature of experience in relation to education? And one of the other primary hopes is to expand the spatial and poetic imagination that is understood as architecture. Right? How do we imagine architecture? And I have to say, in many ways, both of these hopes have grown from my long-running conversations with these gentlemen. You know, I have been so lucky to have learned so much from each of them. And it really does have to do with depth. It has to do with precision. It has to do with this kind of force of intellect. But I believe it shows us they're lifelong searches. I mean, they've really engaged in a kind of lifelong exploration. And it shows us what's possible. And I'm talking about what's possible if we just keep listening, if we just keep growing and exploring our questions. So I want to thank each of them for joining us in this SunShip. I look forward to continuing our long, slow, thoughtful conversations for many, many years to come. Thank you. And now I will hand it over to Andreas and Chris to begin the program.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Chris, I can maybe start sharing my desktop, and with that, our presentation. So, okay, I can't see anyone anymore, so I hope you can see me. Somebody say yes.
Yeah, I can see.
Yeah.
Okay. This is first. I'd like to thank, of course, David and Michael and Chris for inviting me to this. I'm super honored to be part of this. It's my first time. I hope I do a good job. And I'm really keen on listening to questions that arise at the end of this. The most of these things when the audience asks questions, and oftentimes, you know, really wonderful things happen after a good question. So I want to also sort of pay respect a little bit to my personal experience here in Greece over the last week or so. There's been these fires, one human life so far confirmed lost, untold millions of dollars of a property, untold disruption, and also hundreds of millions of trees and wildlife lost to wildfires, which tragically, some of them are that we are told are set by humans who have now been arrested. And it boggles my mind. I do not understand this. I have worked in firefighting before in America, and it is true that the firefighters themselves set the fires, about 1/3 of them, because of money. They get paid. Sort of understandable. Here in Greece, it just makes no sense to me, because they get paid whether they work or not. These are 2 light bulbs that were near our home, which we have evacuated twice, and we had to be evacuated from 2 other locations because of these fires that just consumed the entire island of Evia. These light bulbs, or were glass light bulbs that melted. This is my home again, and this is my mother's and my daughter's swimsuits, and they melted. And of course, you can see the charring here. This here is what the sun looked like after we're done through the smoke. It's just a red dot, and this is us escaping on a ferry boat. Everything you see here, that's the sun, believe it or not, and everything you see here is not cloud, it's smoke, and that's the island of Evia burning. So with that horrible image, I will let's do some science with it. I mean, science always lifts me up. So I think I want Chris to talk a little bit about what we saw there, the hues and the colors.
Can you just back up to your image of the clouds and the sunset, Andreas?
Yes, I did.
Can you? Yeah. Okay. I want to say something about this as an introduction to color, because a lot of us are taught that color has a specific frequency or a fraction of the visible wavelength. But if you were to try and name some of the colors in those images, it would be virtually impossible because we don't have the language. The language, is it yellow or orange or brown, or are they black? Is there gray? Is there other colors that I can't even name? So if you go to the next slide.
Trying, hold on. Yep.
Yeah, this is talking about color as we are often educated about it, which is an analysis of color that's put into a circle for some reason. I don't know why, but it's a way of organizing color as something you can specify, and it applies to inks and paints and anything of pigments. That people think this is how the human color vision works, but this is only part of the story, as we will show you. So if you go to the next one. The eye drop, or the eye, is essentially a droplet of water enclosed in a system. This is what your eyeball actually does, and your brain turns that into what you see. So therein, that's the first transformation that takes place, is that somehow or other, the squareness of things that we are surrounded with is constructed by a vision that is distorted in that form. So that's quite a complex transformation, a spherical form into a square form, a square volume. So if you go to the next one.
I think if you can hear me now, the next one is about how some paradoxes arise when we think about. I remind you that here we're talking about how we understand things, and we're going to come back to what Chris was saying. And here I would like to say that in academia we often talk about being very specific and very precise, and that is important and that is correct. And we do that. However, this slide here shows you maybe about a third of what my group has been doing in the last 16 or 17 years that I've been at MIT, since about 2004. And in doing all these things, we learned that naming and labels and language are important, and they're dangerous. They're a double-edged sword. So I called my group the label-free research group, because if your name means nothing, then you can do anything. So let me say that again. The reason we're called label-free is because I realized that if your name means nothing, and I really like to do anything. I do not like to be told that biology starts here and physics starts there, and they never should meet, and chemistry is over here and math is something else. No, nature is all one, and therefore we have all these projects. We created the world's efficient bike using grass clippings. This idea of using trash to generate energy has transitioned to what is called mycotexture. Now we're using mushrooms to digest encroacher bush, which is agricultural trash, the buildings in Namibia. That same technology that allowed us to stabilize these proteins, the technology to stabilize olfactory receptor proteins to create the world's most sensitive bioelectronic nose, which is more sensitive than even the dog's nose, which currently is the best diagnostic tool we have for many diseases. So the paradox is that even though we have very specific in science, these labels sometimes limit us. So we are experts really in my group, specializing. We're definitely specializing, but we're specializing in not specializing. And that is a little bit of a paradox. Well, how can you be a little bit of everything? I ask, how can you be? I mean, how can you do science without understanding all of it? So we are going after all of it. And this approach is not unique to my group. This is why MIT has numbers instead of names for departments. And this sort of aggressive ignorance of boundaries is what makes us the 10th economy of the intellectual property generated by companies that are, the money, the revenue generated by companies that are leveraging MIT IP puts us as the 10th or 7th, something between the 10th and the 17th economy on the planet, somewhere between Russia and India. And there's about 10 people at MIT, 1,000 of them are generating this IP, and yet we're more productive economically, at least if you think about it. We have more impact this way than whole countries. So how can this be? There's a bit of a paradox here. And this is Richard Feynman's last few words. He left them on his blackboard. Richard Feynman was a professor of physics at MIT for a while. Then he went to Caltech. And he said, this is the last day. He died after this. On his board was left, what I cannot create, I do not understand. So if you really think about it, I was under the impression for many, many years, even after under my really interesting things, that you must understand something before you build it, right? You can't build a bridge if you don't understand the physics, right? Well, not quite. If it's something known, like making a pizza or making a bridge, then yes, you must understand to recreate it. But if it's something known, you must build it to understand it. Let me say that again. My whole group is built on this idea. You must build it to understand it. Think of the Wright brothers. They build the airplane in order to understand how the airplane works. They didn't know how the airplane works. Build it. We build a nose in order to understand how the nose works. This is one of our first prototypes. This went to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency of the Department of Defense of the United States. This beat the dog and a bunch of other groups that were competing. It is a very, very sensitive nose. It's big. It's about the size of a desktop computer, but it's also very dumb. Does not come close to the artificial dog intelligence that we're now getting into. And this here is the latest iteration of this. And as you can see, it is smaller than an iPhone. Is I hope this technology has taken form of, and it's alive almost in almost literal form. There are living proteins on top of there that are helping this technology smell disease and other things. And this technology is trying real hard to get into your cell phone. Imagine a world where you smell the world the same way that you can take pictures of the world. You can have portals the same way that we are talking to each other now, and you can understand what the smell environment is. And remember that these things are, smells are just as important as sight. And in fact, for diagnostic purposes, even more important. This will tell you which dimensions of perception here.
Well,
hey, Andreas. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in with a very brief observation? What you said, Andreas, about how building it produces the understanding of it reminds me a lot of a realization I had when I did a book a few years ago about the symbiotic relationship between representation and understanding. So Werner Heisenberg said that we have to be careful because what we see is not nature herself. This is an exact quote. What we see is not nature herself, but nature exposed to our method of understanding, our method of questioning. And then he warned that contemporary thought can even be endangered by the picture of nature drawn by science, with the danger lying in the fact that the picture is now regarded as an exhaustive account of nature itself, so that science forgets that it's studying its own picture. But you have to also look at the ways in which our understanding requires representation. So there's this symbiotic relationship between representation and understanding, with the latter not necessarily preceding the former. So that's like building the plane and figuring out how to build a plane as you build the plane. Or there are other fantastic examples of supercomputer simulations of galaxies, producing the 3D representation of galaxy structures, producing the understanding that they are doing a certain thing. So the mapping precedes the understanding. So I just find that very provocative.
Sometimes, not always. Building sometimes, in my experience, what happened with the nose is I went in trying to build this thing here, thinking I knew how the nose worked. I had read all the textbooks. I had read and written papers about it, pontificate, professing that it works like we know it works. Everybody knows how the nose works. It's a bunch of chemicals, blah, blah, blah. Well, going into building this thing slapped me around quite a bit. The universe did, because it taught me that I did not know how the nose works. In building it, I understood it.
Right.
Now, it's not always the case. You're right. Sometimes, especially if you to reproduce something, like in a simulation case. And we actually have it's interesting that you say this, because we have a supercomputer simulation of olfactory receptors in a minute, and I'll show it. And it's quite poignant because you hit it right on the head. The supercomputer simulation actually also talks about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. To that in a minute. This has some very important points to make about that. Also chime in with Michael about how perception is, even though the world is supposedly three-dimensional, maybe four if you add time, it's perception is in fact much more interesting. So there's Chris's.
Anyway, I cut off Chris, and I feel I've been feeling bad about it. So
That's
Chris.
okay. So in parallel with this, I want you to bear this in mind as we go on a number of streams together, which will join up at the end. That this is how I'm going to talk about how the brain adds dimensions into things, into our representation of things. So you can, another example of a paradox is that you have to understand something to represent it, and you have to represent it to understand it, and the two things work side by side. Now this is how we essentially structure our three-dimensional environment locally, is in X, Y, and Z axis. And this is fundamental to our structuring of our knowledge and our experience. If you go on to the next one, can you go to the next slide? You can see that this has a very light, just those two diagrams, the original one of the color in a circle. This diagram is a more complex example of how the brain constructs color, because the X, Y, and Z axis construct the sphere, which is our notation of the sphere. But inside that, there is an inclined plane that goes from light to dark. And in fact, if you see that the yellow and purple are at an inclined plane, that the yellow is paler, is lighter in value at maximum saturation. And the violet, which is opposite, is darker in color at its maximum saturation. But the red and green are the same saturation opposite each other. Now that inclination plane can be varied by the brain in order to obtain the maximum color contrast that's available in any ambient light. So already we've got a dynamic system, but that's just our representation, and there are other things going on which we'll come to in a second. If you go on to the next slide, Andreas. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Now, just briefly, the eye and the brain intersect in the middle at something called the LGN, the lateral geniculate nucleus. And the point about showing you this image is that we think we see with the eyes, but you could say that we see mostly with the brain, because only about 18% of what we see travels from the retina to the LGN. And most of what we see actually comes from the brain to the LGN. And you could regard the LGN as an inner eyeball. So that's a process of the construction of vision. Now, because 80% of what we see comes from the brain, you could also say that our education and our life experience, our memories and our calibration of time and all those things, they're all packed into what we actually foresee. So it's not an input-output paradigm. It's much more complex than that. It's layered with all sorts of information. And it's why people can see different things according to how they're educated, for example. So you can go to the next now. One example of the inclined plane at work is what's called the opponent cell theory of how we see. And you can see that the violet is the dark. Now that is an example of the maximum color contrast you can get in a normal lighting situation. But that plane, the inclination plane, can vary around, as I've said, to give you different kinds of color in different kinds of lighting. So for example, if you're under sodium lighting or fluorescent lighting, you get very different balances of color. And so the color actually in nature is changing all the time. It's on the move, it's always changing. So static light is an unnatural condition. And just a side fact, the light that comes from a candle has all 4 forms of carbon in it for a moment or two, which is why it's a very stable light form and it has a particular quality. Anyway, you can go on now. And over to you, Andreas.
Yes. So take a little bit of a breath here. I remind because this got a little bit complex. We've structured this presentation to have a little bit of a kind of almost humorous breaks that we find might be poignant and interesting also to the audience. So I remind you that this section here, we were talking how language affects our perception, how language affects how we see the world. This is my daughter when she was about maybe 3 or so, and this is my son when he was maybe under 1. And I was diaper, and Petra, my daughter, comes in and says, "What's that smell, Daddy?" Now, my instinct, having been in olfaction science for so long, was to point to the diaper and say, "That's what's giving you that smell." A moment of clarity, so I kind of paused for a second, and instead of answering immediately, I said, because my instinct, by the way, was to say, "Oh, it's indole and scatol, the odorants that cause the blah blah blah." Yeah, it would have been the mess. So instead, I said, "What does that smell tell you?" "What's that? What does that smell tell you?" "What's that smell? What does it tell you?" "I don't want to eat it." So I asked her back, and her answer was very deep. The smell tells her she doesn't want to eat that. Now think about that for a second. Smells or even colors to objects, we say black shirt, pink phone, etc., etc. We point to something and we say the word of the something and the attribute, being it the color, or if somebody asks, "What's that?" point to, we say that's what that smell is coming from. But if you ask, "What does that smell tell you?" you get a really deep answer from a 2.5-year-old who says, "That smell tells me I don't want to eat it." And that immediately allows you to understand neuroscience quite deeply. To you to be an aversive smell is telling you stay out of it. Think about if the ramifications of this and how deeply it can go. If instead of playing, talking about molecules and the language of chemistry being in sort of diagrams and equations, we spoke of it of sentiments tell you and how they manage your behavior. And the applications of this are endless and completely untapped currently. One is, of course, diagnosis of disease. That's my favorite. I think it's very powerful. We now have launched a startup that can do magnificent things with based things that cannot be done so far by any other method. Much faster, better, cheaper, and more effectively. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another one is just something that will resonate with everyone, I think. If you're on a diet, let's say, and I like donuts, right? I'll eat, but I really don't want to eat the donuts. If I want to eat the donuts, even if I'm very, very hungry, imagine your favorite food. If you were to imagine yourself trying to eat that in the stinkiest bathroom you've ever been, immediately your appetite goes, and you don't even actually be in the stinking bathroom. You can just imagine it. You can just even have the visual in your head, and your appetite is suppressed. It's a very cheap trick to change your to play diet. Another one is if you have a very bad wine, or unless it's really horrifical, you can actually improve it, your to various characters of it that you like. That's what Somalis do. They narrate the wine for you, and they tell you things about it that you would like. The more attention you pay to a wine, the better it tastes. The more attention you pay to the wine's character that you like, the more of that character you will experience. And this is not a trick. Perception, and it's real. And if you do the fMRI scan of the brain, you'll see that it even has a, if you fall for that kind of stuff, it does have a neural correlate. So talking about how language changes how we perceive things, it's important about the questions you ask and the conventional wisdom that isn't always our friend. Conventional wisdom is to point to something and say, that's what that smell is. Here's more conventional wisdom that paradoxically is not correct. You've all heard that dogs are better at smell than humans. And indeed, they can present a dog wearing an infrared collar, well, infrared light that has been tracked. And here's the pheasant, and the dog does this. In the night, you can find the pheasant. Well, here's I think I want to say a CITYX student in the grass, blindfolded, looking for chocolates. Look at the tracks. I mean, they're, in fact, humans have more advanced sense of smell in the sense of from the standpoint of variety and ecology. We are very keen on our mother's cooking, not somebody else's cooking, and all that. Dogs are not that keen on differentiation, but they're very keen on perception, molecules, and a very trace sense. You must have heard at least one of these three. Always in very high profile, even scientific journals, peer reviewed and everything, we hear such nonsense, such as every textbook currently that I've ever seen says that humans can smell, can smell 10,000 smells. I've actually tried to track that down. You know where it comes from? Nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. It is absolute nonsense. There's no backing to it. There's no. It's as silly as saying, oh no, it's actually only 7 cents, or no, it's actually 1 cent. It's silly to count how many scents you can smell as asking you how many songs can you recognize, how many paintings can you recognize, how many pencils can you recognize, how many pens. If you're interested in pens, you will be able to recognize all sorts of historical pens and this and that and the other. Ask. It is not a good question to ask, and it does not accept a numerical answer. And sure enough, it doesn't smell. This definitely doesn't go in a combinatorial way, as people are always claiming. And that is not the real reason why we can smell a trillion scents. You can probably remember as many songs as you capacity to pay attention to. If you're really interested, there's people out there who can remember many, many more than you can. So it's similar in every respect to audition and vision. And this is what I want you to take away as far as smell goes. And yeah.
The prone position of your blindfolded, your unfortunate blindfolded subject there, who I guess was rewarded with chocolate at the end of his or her journey, makes me think that it's possible that if we hadn't evolved to walk upright, if our noses had remained close to the ground, then our centers of smell, our way of experiencing the world might be quite different. We might really value smell more than we do. It's not that we don't. But,
yes, you could not be more right. You could not be more right, Michael. It's absolutely, you're totally right. The reason I think that our smell is de-emphasized is because we're upright, and vision becomes more important, and more smells are closer to surfaces, right? And the biggest surface on the planet is the ground. So dogs, their brain, most of its brain is actually used by the smell, or it has two, so do have 2 organs for smell. The Jacobson organ is called in the dog. The vomeronasal organ is called in the human. You might have heard of pheromones. It's not a myth. They do exist. You can't consciously perceive them, but they do alter your behavior. So indeed, it is that our nose is not close to the ground, because once we pedal, our vision became paramount. But absolutely correct, yes. But you can train yourself. And in fact, I play this game with my children. I will put a little perfume on a cotton ball. We put it. They love it, by the way. As soon as you blindfold someone, you have to have a level of trust there. But somebody's not going to head and on the floor. Molecules that are chemicals come into your nose, and that's when you experience scent. And photons that are not chemicals, that are particles of light, come into your eyeball and you experience light. However, there's not the distinction is quite silly. There's nothing or even quantitative different about it, other than the form in which the signal enters the primary sensing apparatus. In fact, this here should shock everyone who hasn't seen it before. But this is your short, medium, and long wavelength receptors that exist in your retina. In fact, the 7 colors that we see are so your brain reads and says, okay, if this is firing maximally and this is firing minimally, then I am here, etc., and all that. Now, everyone thinks that the more signal, the more information, right? How can I have more information with less signal? Well, indeed, I have a form of dyschromatopsia, it's called. It's not exactly color blindness, but my red and green receptors are kind of leaking into each other, sort of like how they're on this diagram. In reality, this should be a little bit over to the right, so their peaks are slightly more separated. And because of this, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so you can see my face. This phone, to most people, and I do not know if it translates on this on the Zoom, but this side here should appear pink. Now, those of you who see gray instead of pink are like me, and you have those 2 receptors leaking into each other. Think there's a, and I have no full disclosure, 0 stocks in this company. I'm not endorsing this product. There might be other products that are better. This company is called Enchroma. I don't know if it's going to work on Skype. We're going to try on Zoom. We're going to try it. This is clearly it decreases some of the light. Oh wow, it's just reflecting my now my. Those of you who saw gray, you should be seeing pink now. I can see it. So without these glasses on, I see gray. With these glasses on, I see pink. The glasses clearly cut down some of the light, right? They're dark. Yet what's happening here, let's go back to my screen here, is that I am cutting out exactly here, and I'm separating these 2. So I'm cutting down on the signal, and yet I get more information because now I can see more color. This should blow your mind. Sometimes you are indeed blinded by the light. Indeed, the music is too loud for there's too much signal to understand what's going on. So anytime anybody tells you more data is better, no, more data is not better. It is case by case. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. For me, having too much light and not having this notch filter that this company so brilliantly, nothing to do with them. I did not invent it. I don't get paid to talk about this, but they are brilliant. They figured out how to they put a notch filter just there, and they have 3 different versions of these glasses. You take a test online, and you might have seen these YouTube clips of people just crying when they start seeing something I've seen before. The first time I put them on, a Coca-Cola truck, the big red truck, walked by, and it was like a punch in the face. I had never seen red before this vibrant. It was suddenly, it was like, wow, that's what everybody's been talking about, red being such a cool. That should tell you something. More information, more signal does not mean more data, does not mean more information. More data does not mean more information.
Isn't that like
and
distinction between information and knowledge?
Right, that's exactly
You
that.
can be flooded by
And it's not even
data points without having knowledge, wisdom. You know.
Yeah. And in my case, it's really not even knowledge or wisdom. I aspire to those things, but just basic information. The color pink on this phone. But by the way, I bought it before I bought the glasses. I wouldn't have bought a pink phone normally, but then I thought it was great. Then it became a nice showpiece. So I'm using it for all my lectures. Now, another thing. So we learned here paradoxically that more data doesn't mean more information, doesn't mean more, in my case, more photons don't mean more colors. It means fewer colors. Another paradox is perhaps that context in vision, olfaction, audition, and everything else is actually almost more critical than the signal itself. This is a famous picture where the context makes you think that these 2, A and B, are different colors, but indeed they're the same. Think of another famously by Shakespeare, that's what's in a name, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Would it? I ask you to think, what would a flower called shit flower smell like? I'm pointing your attention to the character that isn't very pleasant. Another thing is who is born and then are abused by somebody who smells of roses, and that person comes smelling of roses and bangs them on their head every day. Well, that person will have an association to the smell of a rose that is very negative. So no, the paradox that smell or color is objective is complete nonsense. And this context is key in understanding everything from immunology and pharmacology that I work in, from pain perception to even architecture. The context in which we'll talk on Friday about mycotecture, which is building with mushrooms, and the context in which Namibian people was seen, it was like, why are you wanting us to live in these weird shapes? All you rich people in the West live in houses with triangular roofs. Why are you making us live in, you're proposing that we build differently. So context is for kings, as was told in Star Trek. The latest Star line is for kings. Information is for the peasants. So context is king, really. This is for Chris to tell us about the vision. And
well, I was talking about the way the brain adds in dimensionality in various ways. And this is the first step. At the bottom, you can see a range of specific frequencies that we call a spectrum. And it also has a similar graph to the one Andreas showed. But the forms above show you how the receptors are tuned, but they're wired differently. So the yellow, for example, takes information from all three, red, blue, and green. The red only takes information from the red. The green only takes information from the green. And all of them contribute to white. When you add them all together, you get white. And the brain essentially constructs the opposite of white and adds it in, as far as I understand. Now that distinction of colors, red and green, which is an evolutionary stage that is more recent, and yellow and blue, yellow is the color of sunlight, for example, and its opposite is the dark blue. That relates to this sphere that I showed you, where this is a constructed relationship between blue, yellow, green, red, white, black. Now you can see that is a different order of magnitude than the spectrum that's showed underneath. But I just wanted to come in there at that point, and then we go to the next image, Andreas.
Well, here I wanted you to very quickly show you the diagram without going through too much detail of how olfaction looks like, and I want you to keep a little bit and play it back when Chris is talking about the wiring of the visual system. The point I'm making here is that apart from this part, where we have a chemical attaching to a receptor, the rest of the system is wired identically. It's using the same primary proteins called GPCRs, G protein coupled receptors, always 7 transmembrane domains. Also, a big mystery to me is why does nature always use the number 7 for everything that it senses? Every perception that we have in the human goes via 7 transmembrane receptors: heat, cold, toxicity, taste, smell, vision, audition, all of those, everything, touch, etc. All the sensory mechanisms have the same primary structure. They have different stimuli: odorants in the case of olfaction, in the case of vision. However, look at this diagram and see what Chris is going to tell you about how the organization of the visual system goes.
Well, one aspect of it is that there is a translation from the original stimulus, which is a grid of 8 by 8 cells, 64 in total. Or in this case, is 64 by 64, which is 4090. But it goes through a process of compression and then re-expansion to the output image. That's just one layer. And in fact, the auditory system and the sight and hearing, they all use the same architecture of repeated expansion and compression and expansion and compression. And any signal that survives with a repeated compression is remembered and turned into a sort of sign or a caricature of the input, which is recognizable and durable. It's what's called a durable signal, rather than something that's ephemeral. And you could say a particular color, like yellow or purple, is ephemeral. But when it's applied to an actual object, when you see experiential color, which goes back to the clouds that we showed at the beginning, that's experiential color. And that's not the same thing as spectrum colors, because spectrum colors have a wavelength, whereas experiential color has many wavelengths, and probably too many to analyze. But anyway, I'm sure, I think if you go to the next slide, Andreas. Yeah, this shows you how the light system, the vision system, and the sound system, hearing, they use the same architecture neurologically, so that there are, you can see that there are stages of compression and stages of expansion between different nerve structures or different cellular structures. And they're essentially the same system. It's the same process used for the different senses. They all use repeated compression and expansion. So we can go to the next image. This is another stage after that, where what survives that process of repeated expansion and compression is then analyzed and given a value, so that you see that there is a kind of sorting out that's pretty complex, but it results in some simple categorization of things, which is very hard to describe other than through diagrammatic terms. How do you put characteristics to a face, for example? There are many ways of doing it, but that just shows you one example. And I'm indebted to Paul Churchland's book, Plato's Camera, for these images, because he explained it at great length. Paul Churchland was an author of a book on the subjects of the vision and the senses. So can we go to the next slide?
So here, Chris spoke about diagnostic prowess of the visual system. And here I want to show you a dog actually diagnosing prostate cancer. So these are three, you can hear the clicks. Okay, so these are three vials of urine that contain urine from a person without prostate cancer, and with prostate cancer. And you saw the dog has been diagnosed. And this is the pressure applied by the snout. This is research that was funded by the Prostate Cancer Foundation to be undertaken at MIT and at Medical Detection Dogs and many partner institutions. And what you see here is doing this diagnostic is very, very similar to what the brain does for only here in the case of the dog. And this is what we're talking about when we're saying artificial dog intelligence, being able to mimic what the dog does so accurately. And by the way, I have to tell people this because it really blows my mind still. And I've been in this field for 15 years now. 15 years have been trained to diagnose many different diseases: Parkinson's, malaria, now COVID, okay, all sorts of cancers, diabetic shock, incipient imminent diabetic shock, and many, many other conditions. In every single case, the dogs have been properly trained. Out every technology, every hospital test that we ever compared them to, and by miles and miles. We're talking, for instance, in the case of COVID, they can do it with 99% accuracy in 0.4 seconds. We did 250 passengers in Heathrow Airport by in the UK, and they managed this in 250 people in 45 minutes. Most of the time was spent for the dog walking from one person to the next. Now, clearly, dogs do not belong in the medical system. However, I mean, you'd have to be, I don't know what, so this belongs in your phone. We cannot be fighting pandemics with masks and Q-tips up our noses. This is 2021, not 1521. We cannot be looking for prostate cancer, inserting 20-inch needles up people's bums and biting the prostate to figure out the biopsy. All this communicates via the utterance that your body constantly sheds. Your body constantly is talking in the language of scent, and trained dogs can pick it up and they can understand they can figure out whether you're stressed, your anxiety levels, your mental health, your physical health, etc. So that we open up this perception to humans. I think the most obvious place to put it is in your phone, not in your fridge or your bathroom or your toilet. Okay, those places too. However, you take your phone everywhere anyway. You saw that the sensors are small enough, and of course, this opens up a lot of interesting ideas about how this will proceed. And Michael has a lot to say about this, I'm sure. But now I've already moved to the next slide for Chris to talk to us about the Swiss roll.
Yeah, this drawing, it shows you a further way that the brain can add dimensionality into the way of what we would call measuring things. But in fact, it's a complex dimensional realm that the brain works in. It's many more dimensions than just the three I mentioned at the beginning, X, Y, and Z. And this drawing shows you how, if you imagine a field of data points rolled up in a Swiss roll effect like this, it can show you that there are two ways around this system of relating points of data relevance to each other. One way is to follow the surface around, but the other way is to jump across the gap between two surfaces and short circuit the process of creating a relationship. So that's another way of adding dimensionality in the way the system is working.
Chris, is that empirical or is that theoretical? That wormhole jump between leaves of the scroll or sections of the scroll, which we were discussing. Is that empirical data? Does that happen, or is that theory?
As far as I understand it, it's a representation of what happens in multiple dimensions in the nervous tissue. We come up against the limits of ability to represent things on two-dimensional plane. So drawing ultimately, paradoxically, and here we are again with another paradox, that even the most complex ideas can be represented on a flat plane through drawing, because we're already assuming it's three-dimensional, even though we're looking at a two-dimensional object. We're assuming it's three-dimensional, but in fact, it's talking about other dimensions added into that. But as far as we can go through representation.
I'm just curious if that coiling process happens physically within the brain. You know, is there a physical coiling?
Yeah, I think no, there isn't. Well, as far as I understand, there isn't physical coiling as such, but you have to think of the brain as a multi-dimensional network of solid material.
Right.
And so this is a simplification in one sense of what goes on within the solid material of the brain mass.
Right. Brilliant.
So Andreas.
Yes, so this is now to the point of both Michael and Chris before. This is a supercomputer simulation of what goes on when you're sending a molecule called an odorant. This took over a year of a giant supercomputer to compute. Well, not the whole time computing. We're fixing many different problems with it, which tells you something about simulation. It's a little bit of a dark magic art. However, these odorant molecules, as you see, they're bouncing around the side of your receptor. So this would be something that you've inhaled, and it's now sits in between your eyeballs, a little bit higher up. That's where the actual sensing happens, not in your snout, but higher up in your forehead. And these molecules are vibrating and just on, and this receptor with its 7 transmembrane domains, it has 7 of these springy parts. From here to here is 5 nanometers. This is a membrane of an olfactory sensory neuron. You can see that it plays a little bit of dance. Then what happens as part of this sensing is that molecules diffuses into the hydrophobic pocket and binds there, either for a long time or for a short time, depending on how intense the smell is. And in doing so, what has happened now is the molecule has changed its shape. It has been changed by the interaction with the receptor. And the receptor changed its depth because it now has this extra matter here. So this is very, very deep. We always talk about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle as applying to photons or maybe electrons, but it actually applies to here too. What it means is that you cannot act on the world, and those that act on only interact with the world. The act of observation changes you, the observer, and the observed. You cannot observe someone as a voyeur without them knowing. You might not think that they're knowing, but there is some interaction that is happening there. And this is the same as the deepest part of physics is Newton's third law. Newton's third law says that for every action, there is an equal in magnitude and opposite in direction reaction. That is as deep as physics gets. If you were to throw everything away from physics, somebody said, say, future generations, and I thought about it for a bit, and Feynman answered, I would say that the world is made of atoms. I don't think that's a very clever answer. I think the cleverest answer I can come up with is that I would tell the world Newton's third law. The rest of it will follow, including philosophy, including everything we do. Sure.
Yeah, it's like
you
a
can
mirror.
act on some. Yes, it's impossible to act. Also, it's very empowering to think this way. You can never say, oh, what is the world doing to me? Why my life sucks? Oh, this stuff is happening to me. Well, no, you're happening to it too, in equal magnitude and opposite direction. Yeah. And how you perceive the world and what you've perceived of the world is affecting what others will perceive. If I inhale a perfume and then I exhale it and you inhale my breath, that same molecule of perfume will smell differently because it has interacted with my receptors. And it goes on forever. So take that home, if you will. The world isn't happening to you, and neither are you happening to the world. It's only a dance of interaction. That's the only thing that's available to us. I don't know what happened here. Okay, so we're almost at, and I wanted to note also that we all are pretty good at using our eyes, I think, being architects here, a lot of architects. But I want you to start paying attention to your nose too. I wasn't one of those people who was born with a extra sense of nose. You know, many people are available to talk to if you want. For instance, we have a very lady now from Scotland, where Chris is, who has so far achieved 100% success at sniffing out Parkinson's disease on T-shirts of people who slept in a completely white T-shirt, no other markings, put in a Ziploc bag, sent. She takes one sniff, yes, Parkinson's, no Parkinson's, something that no diagnostic tool can do, and that's a human. Now, she was born with most likely extra receptors who have not genotyped her yet, and she very famously picked this up because her husband tragically died of Parkinson's when she also noticed a change in his body odor that she recorded in her mind, and she can explain it to us. She says, oh, it smells more musky. But that's like trying to explain red to someone who doesn't see red. It's very, very difficult, right? Unless you've experienced it, you can't. However, a very easy way to up you is to start using that extra sense that you've forgotten, your nose. And I'm not advocating for perfume use, by the way. I would stay clear of perfumes. Perfumes have issues with them. I don't want to scare people who love perfume. That's great, fine. But keep it light. Don't apply too much. Okay? I'll tell you later. But to exercise this nose of yours, that is fantastic, and it's the most powerful diagnostic tool that we have, especially in the dogs. You can start doing things like this. Every time you go to the grocery store and there's an orange, scratch it a little bit, smells the zest, show it to your children, start sniff. It looks a little bit funny, but after a while, you'll see that it really does wonders. You will start experiencing a whole new dimension that perhaps is hidden to you. And the last slide here is that the paradox is that is in fact in caricatures, as we've shown you, that for accurate descriptions, but it's in the characters that we capture the salient essence of things. Yeah. Humor and drawings and things are actually much more powerful in communicating ideas and stories, in communicating emotion, which to me, at least now, recently I've realized because of my relations with and David also, because architecture and all these things that are new to me as a scientist are all about emotion, and it looks to me like emotion is a more fundamental language than language itself, than words or even mathematics. And with this, I want to leave you with this final paradox, that caricature, being a poor representation of reality, if you will, are more powerful. That's a big paradox to me.
But it's very recognizable. That's the process of very complex stages of analysis and categorization, but it can be represented simply by a caricature in the brain, and that's how we remember certain things very distinctly. However, that image, the blue cartoon, was originally drawn by George Hardy, the graphic designer in England. And it's also, apart from being a caricature, it's something that we're not allowed to see. In other words, an inside-out face on a head is not something you can possibly see. And that contains a paradox as well, that there is what we're allowed to see by virtue of what is real, what is possible. And anything that we're exposed to constructs our sense of what is possible, but you're not going to see that particular thing. And yet it is recognizable as a caricature because it's not real. And that's an interesting point on which to leave it.
Yeah. So one last right-hand side of the cartoon. First of all, I did not draw this, and I apologize to the person who did, because it is absolutely brilliant, and I couldn't find who actually did it. I just found it on the internet, and then I lost it again, and I can't find who it is. If somebody knows who made this, please we'll credit them. But I want to really point this out. It says here, you made this, an AI, artificial intelligence based creative tool. I made this. That's what the human user says. And then says, I made this. And it's funny, and it's pointed, and it's interesting. And just recently in and I can share the link for that in the chat in a minute, a court recognized an artificial intelligence with personhood for the purposes of inventorship. So a patent has been awarded, and one of the co-inventors is an artificial intelligence. The other inventor is Stephen Fowler. The famous Stephen is I'm honored to have him as a co-founder of the company Sentient, which is leveraging his AI and my nose and machine olfactory approach to diagnostics to actually do these prostate cancer diagnostics with artificial dog intelligence. The fact that he battled at the Supreme Court of the United States and in Europe, spending all of his money on this, of his own money, and now some lawyers, of course, they always love the the legal fees and all that. They finally managed to win this battle in South Africa. In courts said that we cannot recognize an AI, an artificial intelligence, with inventorship, because inventorship depends on the idea of conception. So who conceived? However, the judge wrote in this opinion, and his or her opinion, I don't know what gender it was, but the judge wrote, there is a loophole in the law clearly that conception, is that a purely human trait? Could you know whether it was a human or machine that conceived something? In the case of Dabus, which is a system that Stephen Fowler created that does these kind of diagnostics that mimic other things, he claims that, look, I made a machine that is meant to invent and conceive things. And that first patent is entirely human-made. The second patent that he has, he used the machine to create some of the claims. Therefore, he fought. So this happened 2 weeks ago. So we are in a precipitative moment in history where, for the first time, we've recognized artificial intelligence as having personhood. I think this is the beginning of something very big. And if that's paradoxical to you, I'd love to hear your about this. I think it's time to open it up to questions. We've been going on for over an hour now, and I'll stop sharing my screen, but I might start again if there's questions that necessitate the sharing of some slides.
Wow. Holy smokes. Fantastic. Absolutely beautiful, stunning. And I always learn so much every time I listen to you guys. And I do want to open up the questions. I'm just going to riff a little on some things that entered my mind while I was listening. Deep wrestling with recognition in all of its senses, and of course, recognition. Right, the meaning representation, remember, all the re's in the world, it goes on and on. But the fundamental idea that that our perception, our recognition of something in the world is, of course, part of consciousness, it's part of our cognitive capacity, and linked to what we have experienced before. right? I mean, this is moving through many of the points that were made, that what we experience is constantly articulating what we will experience, right? There's a constant conversation. At any given moment, the nature of our experience is transforming our future experiences. And that's why I often argue, education, right? We have to broaden the spectrum of experiences that we understand as education, because literally, as you all have perfectly articulated, perception itself is altered by our understanding. And I was wrestling a little bit with the drawing. I mean, I love drawing and I think about drawing a lot. As I'm sure you all have heard, the idea that we don't just draw our thoughts, but drawing is thinking, right? Drawing is a form of thinking. And I think one of the formulations I was working on while I was listening to you is the idea that, because, you can make a drawing of something, right? Meaning representation. The of, a drawing is of a house or of a bear, but it always is something. And that isness of what it is contains what it's of, right? It can be of, but it doesn't give up its isness because it's of something. And so in that wrestling, I was thinking about perception as a form of knowledge, right? Meaning normally we have a formulation where we say, the more the more you can broaden your perception, you'll know more. But perception itself as an active form of understanding, it is in fact a participatory understanding of the world. Like we say, drawing is thinking, right? That it's not only about your thoughts. I think the question of conception, the question of reproduction, and I mean biological reproduction, and I mean mechanical reproduction, right? The unbelievable will to double ourselves into the world, right? Whether that means photography, drawing, film, Instagram, 1,000 selves doubled and discharged, constantly pushing out. I have to believe that in different temporalities and different durations, those two reproductions are linked. Right? Biological reproduction, the human will to reproduce, and the desire to be remembered, be recognized, right? To represent ourselves out into the world. I think that those are linked. And the last note that I was wrestling with, well, listen, by the way, I'm colorblind. That did come up for me quite a bit. I didn't see any pink when you had the it was still great to me, but it's, but Chris has been telling me to try those glasses for years. But I mean, one last point, which it came up when you were talking at the end about the law, because obviously all these things, I mean, the law is deeply implicated. And I remembered two things. One, Avicenna, the great Persian thinker, lived 1,000 years ago, literally from like 980 to 1025 or something, like this period, 1,000 years ago. Giant mind, can't even begin to explain. But I always find it fascinating that Avicenna had written two major canons in his life. One of them was looking at social, political interaction, economic interaction, different forms of society, and he called that the canon on health. And the other one was looking at the body and the organs of the body and all of the things that he could explore relative to our biological condition. And he called that the law. And I find it just kind of overwhelmingly brilliant. And in that, to me, there is a kind of, believe it or not, a hope. I'm talking about a hope relative to our social political crisis, right? Relative to how we understand each other, to ethical questions. You know, I often say that the crises of our time are crises of comprehension, and we could say crises of perception. And we could link a lot of the points you were making. You know, whatever the crises we want to do, you started with some significant images of the crises of our time. And partially for me, that means broadening our spectrum of perception and experiences to be able to actually perceive the crisis before we even attempt to act in it. But I want to share one last exchange I had with a friend of mine named Ezekiel. And I was sharing with him, and he's a brilliant young man who knows a lot about biology. And I was sharing with him Chris Rose's, the way he's drawn the optic nerve and light and the visual cortex, and you know what I, you know, because I'm in love with that stuff. So what I understand and what I've learned from Chris about it, and I was taking him through this, and I'll never forget. He said, "And you know, this is all linked to stop and frisk." And it was to stop and frisk, the racist policing practice in New York City. And I couldn't help but think of how succinct that was relative to the social, political, social, poetic imagination, and the fact that so many forms of violence are deeply implicated in the exact questions of perception that you were wrestling with. And I that came up for me at the end when you were talking about the legal designation of forms of reproduction. So anyway, thank you for letting me riff back. And now I do want to say, please, I want to open up the questions, and I would like people to just unmute and shoot away directly. Sometimes we do it in the chat, but I think for this one, we should really have people just speak up and ask anything. I'm trying to, well, I guess I should say, do we have any questions?
Well, I can speak to the one question that was posted. It's an excellent question. Christina Rosati says, typically I learned about the nose/smell by building it that I didn't know before. And that's an excellent question. And it has a very specific answer. The biggest thing I learned is that knowing what something's made of doesn't tell you what it smells of. Similar, all the pixels that go into making the Mona Lisa does not tell you what the Mona Lisa painting looks like. And even seeing the Mona Lisa and analyzing it and then recording it in every which way doesn't quite capture the essence. And yet a caricature, somebody who has studied the Mona Lisa, or somebody has seen it enough times, and how it is in the various arenas that it does, you can recognize it as a cartoon and drawn by Bart Simpson. In fact, I should probably show one like that. So when I first started building the noses, we had a big meeting with all the scientists, like 400 people, and was, you know, telling us what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to fight against the dog and beat the dog at its own game and all that. That was over 10 years ago. Very wonderful program called DARPA Real Nose. Now, somebody asked from the audience, the program manager was up speaking. Do you want us to build a nose that tells you what something smells of or what it's made of? And the program manager says, oh, well, that's the same thing. And I thought the same way. I thought, yeah, of course, that's the same thing. If I know all the chemicals that go in, of course I can do it. Yeah? Well, no, that's a big difference. It's like pixels of the Mona Lisa. Do you know what it looks like? Nope. If I give you all the ingredients of a cake, do you know what it tastes like? Nope. If I give you the recipe of a fragrance, will you know what it smells of? No. Even if you're trained, you will not know. Because it is in the tasting and the smelling and the seeing that what it smells like and what it tastes like happens, not in the list of ingredients. Now, why did we, all of our scientists, all of us, and myself included, think that knowing the list of ingredients is what is needed to know what something smells of? It's because analytical chemists always answer, what is this, by giving a list of molecules and concentrations. That is the answer to what is this. This is like my daughter when she said, what's the smell? And I wanted to point to the poop. That wouldn't have answered. The correct question is, what's the smell? What does the smell tell you? That story. And the same smell and the same behavior can be elicited with different molecules, the same emotion can be elicited with different words, with different sounds. I can play you a sad song, you'll get sad. I can read you a sad sonnet by Shakespeare, you'll get sad. I'll get you the same place. Modality itself, it will be photons or phonons for the ears, or we do not know if we have a sad smell yet. Maybe actually it's an interesting thing. I never thought of a sad smell. The smell of death is not sad, it's actually aversive. I don't know if there's actually, that's very cool, very interesting. Is there a sad smell? There's a happy smell, I think, cookie smell, right? Perhaps flowers, but maybe somebody can help me out. What is a sad smell?
Well, rotting garbage is a sad.
No, those are all aversive, not sad. You want to run away from them. You go, it's disgust, not sadness. I do not know if I can create the sad smell. I think a sad smell you must before the
late autumn. April
like who's dead.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs from the dead land, mixing memory and desire, that's Eliot. The fall can produce sad smells, the summer's over, time is passing. There are these.
Yeah, if those, right, maybe those are ingrained, but now I'm riffing completely. I don't know what I'm talking about currently. You're seeing my brain in action, but I'm thinking, since disgust is, everybody can tell, death, poop, all that, disgust, aversion, that may be a more fundamental, a more sort of firm thing you get. However, sadness, maybe you have to associate it with something. I mean, I can see that if I smell...
It's like Proust, with his Madeleine.
Yeah,
there's smells associated with an experience you had, and then you smell it. Yeah. So that's the Pavlovian thing. Yeah. By the way,
this because
sorry,
sadness relies in the association rather than the actual smell.
Right, maybe, yeah, maybe. While disgust and attractiveness actually is more fundamental, I think. But I don't know. I'm and others. I am thinking at you at this point. I do not know. I'm not telling you. I'm thinking at you. Sorry.
I wanted to just mention that cartoon at the end reminded me of something that the great Arthur C. Clarke said to me directly. We were talking about, the scene in 2001: A Space Odyssey where the man-ape figures out that this bone is maybe not just some object, but could maybe be used for something, and then starts smashing down on the skeletons of the rest of the skeleton, and realizes it could be a weapon, it's a tool, and so on. And then Clarke said to me, it's not so simple that we invented tools and then we built civilization. That's too simple. It's more like we made tools and then the tools made us. By which he meant we make tools and then the tools change how we are in the world and change how our brains are wired. And then we make new tools and then that changes how our brains are wired. And then we keep on building and building it, And so there's this feedback loop. Okay, so then we get to AI. Of course, 2001 got to AI in 1968, after a little consultation with MIT, for example, with the great founder of the Artificial Intelligence Lab, whose name, of course, very embarrassingly escaped me. But so that whole process then is provided or produced in the end, because we're at the end. We're always at the end of time. We're always at the end of time's arrow. This breakthrough moment when an AI is being considered as something that could create something original, if I understood you right. Rather than the creator of the AI, it's the AI. I don't know if the AI is going to get royalties. That's going to be another question. Anyway, sorry.
Caroline.
What?
Thanks. Yeah. A couple of things. The smell sadness thing. I think Chris is right. There's such a strong association with memory of events with smell. It's more so than any other sense, I think. I can still smell my lunchbox from when I was 5 years old. And it associated with me having to say goodbye to my mother. My father having died the year previous, and I probably thought I'd never see her again every morning. And the smell of that lunchbox, I can still smell it. So I think that connection with part of the brain is something about smell that does that. But I was interested in a couple of things. I think your mention of Newton just intrigued me. You shows a particular thing of Newton that is, I don't know, it relates well to the art science esoteric area. But Newton often is kind of contrasted with somebody like Goethe for having reduced everything. And I'm wondering what your views on the Goethe-Newton debate are in relation to what you're saying, because a lot of your work seems to be kind of moving in and out of Western science. So I'd just be interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, I do not know what the Goethe-Newton debate is. You might want to educate me on that. I'd really, but in and out of Western science or Eastern science and all that. True enough, I started off as a hardcore theoretical physicist, quantum physicist. I dabbled a little bit in string theory, which I now find to be probably a cult of some sort, but so is all that. So it's not. But look, at the end, it's that first slide. Everything is connected. We know that, right? The textbooks that we've created, and we said, biology stops here and chemistry starts there. That's nonsense. And I don't see that. Why afraid of everything? It's not that hard. In fact, the more you learn, the easier it is to learn new stuff. So if anything that's happened to me is that I must be missing some kind of part of my brain, because I have really poor memory. So I have to kind of organize things via stories. And those stories kind of become powerful. Not really, scientists generally have good memory. And I also have rampant ADD. Somebody at Wired profiled me and they said I'm consummately overstimulated.
Yeah, I can say something about
and compulsively curious. Yeah, they called me
something about
curious. I think how I approach it.
Andreas, Goethe and Newton. You could say, when it regards light, that Newton divided things to measure them and made them into something concrete and points. Whereas Goethe said that color was produced by the tension of light and dark. And if you look at a rainbow, if you see a rainbow, and I see plenty of those in Glasgow, but a rainbow is dark on the inside and lighter on the outside, because the rainbow itself appears to have stolen all the light and appears as a rainbow. And they're two different ways of thinking. I think they sort of need each other because they bounce off each other, and you get a third thing all the time because you get into new territory.
One thing I find fascinating about Newton is that he spent half his time trying to transmute base metals into gold. So he was an alchemist. He was very much of the ancients as well. He was a bridge between modern science and the ancients. So the part that we value, the part that we nominally value from Newton is that which has been empirically verified. But of course, he was a scientist. He was going through many different experiments and had many different ideas about how the universe worked. Some of them failed, some of them succeeded brilliantly, and we have this. That's why we consider him a genius, not because of the alchemy, but because of that which was indubitably true and could be built upon. Right?
Indubitably true by what measure? Just because we can measure it. I'm sorry.
Part of the process of science is nothing's ever finally true. It's always something that you verify it. Andreas could talk about this, but I'm not a scientist. I'm a generalist. But the scientific method, at least, is a way in which we can test our assumptions and then see if we can build on them, and if we can build further, and then we build further. But one thing that fascinates me is that the more we know, the less we know in a certain way, because the more we know, the border between, as we expand what we know, the border between what we know and what we don't know expands as well. So we have more that we don't know. The more we know, the less we know in a certain way. Right?
Well, an example of the genius of art was with Pointillism, which it's created a luminosity of color perception because it broke experiential colors down into the brightest possible tiny dots. In fact, it pre-vision printing technology. But the exponents of pointillism reduced experiential color to a dot technique, which is actually this, the same principle as Aboriginal painting. But that mimics how the eye perceives color. And so they seem strangely luminous, even though they're talking about gray colors and atmospheric effects. They're using it out of components of bright colors that are very small.
I'm so fascinated that Michael said the scientific method, right? One paradox is that we're not, as scientists, taught the science anything about how to do science, right? You finish grad school and you realize that as a PI, primary investigator, you're basically doing grant writing, budgets, and people management, let alone the scientific method, which isn't actually taught in physics. I got a PhD and 2 master's degrees. I never got the scientific method taught for me. However, it was the Sherlock Holmes method, which says, after you've discarded what's impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is the truth, and you better accept it. And I wrote that for maybe 20 years. And then I realized that that thing is rotten at the core. You cannot impossible. The biggest paradox of all is that it is impossible to know what is impossible. All you can know is what you know, what is possible. What is impossible? How can you know that? It's
proving a negative.
Impossible.
It's like proving a negative. Yeah, proving a negative is impossible. Exactly.
You can't prove. You know what's impossible. Is that it was one of those eureka moments. I think I sweated a pound of sweat afterwards, because it kind of, I looked back and I was like, holy. And just to Michael had, I mean, Chris had a very, very interesting diagram, that cube with all the dimensions. And I was visiting the Maori people, and they told me something very interesting about their language and their perception of time. Now, we in the Western world and many other places, we think of time as going forward. You know, we're looking forward. That's where our eyeballs are pointed. They're pointed into the future. Of course, you all know that everything is in the past already. At the moment, hardly what you can get, and the future's already happened because of the speed of light and all that. The Maori have a different concept of time. They think that you're going into the time backwards, because it's actually more accurate. You know where you've been, so you're looking at the past, and you kind of barely can see over your shoulder the future. Accurate. They think that you're going into time walking backwards. You know where you are now by knowing where you've been. That is their motto. So they literally have people walking backwards to signify the process of time. It is you trying to figure out what the future holds. You can't really tell. Know what. So that's an interesting flipping of the perspective that I learned from the Maori.
Yeah, and that's like that Walter Benjamin riff on the Klee etching about the angel of history, the angel of history being blown backwards, facing back, looking at chaos, piling up, the chaos of history, and being blown backwards into the future as all of the chaos piles up, all the disasters, the rubble of human history, with the wings caught by the past, by the expanding past.
The wind they call progress.
The wind they call progress.
Caroline, you wanted to say something.
I didn't want to take all this floor space, but I'm just interested. I just made a comment in the chat there. You know, your images with the triangle, the diamonds of your olfactory and your visual processing. Because I'm doing a lot of creative thinking teaching, it just looks like the, you know, divergent and then convergent thinking, which of course is also the, you could say the more kind of Newton Goethe, but, you know, like let's diverge and think outside the box, and now let's converge and evaluate. I have no idea what I mean, but I just thought that was an interesting observation.
Yeah. That was used in design strategy in art and design education, that you have to use divergent and convergent thinking. You have to use the binary approach, which is why we got 2 eyes. Essentially, the interesting idea was that the Hindu perception of why we've got 2 eyes is that one eye sees the totality of things all together, and the other eye sees all the individual interactions between things and what they mean. And you have to have both those forms of vision. Now that is true in one sense, but it's obviously not true in the scientific sense of why we have, you know, a left eye and a right eye. But it's true conceptually that we have to see the context as well as the subject. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. The convergence thing with those diagrams is very interesting.
In the land of the blind, the one-eyed colleague is king.
That's called academia.
Many people think that the third eye that cultures often, in various cultures, are aspiring to open is the olfactory epithelium, the
Right.
bulb. It might be true. It might also be the pineal gland. But I find it interesting that the word for mind in Greek, nous, is the same as the word for nose, nous, etc. So they, in many cultures, we say we smelled something out.
Mm-hmm.
You know something. So pay attention to your nose. You might figure something out.
Yes, indeed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, fantastic. Very interesting. You know, on Friday, I will present a number of images of ways of seeing. I mean, you know, insect eyes. And by the way, I have an image of a bee. Bees have two major eyes, you know, with multiple hexagons, and that's how they see color and so on. But they have three more eyes on the back of their head, and those are almost like light meters and help them to navigate.
Is that spiders?
Huh?
Is that spiders, Michael? Spiders?
No, bees.
Bees? Really? They have on the back of their head?
Yes.
They're not-
Yeah, I'll show you an SEM image, electron microscope image captured using electrons, not photons, with the technological eye, looking at bees. And then, but the interesting thing there, or one interesting thing there, is that you know, then you go to the human eye, and then telescopic eye, mirror, and then the larger mirrors of the larger telescopes. For example, the James Webb Space Telescope are hexagons again. So we've gone from, you know, at least we haven't gone, but, you know, I will show, you know, how you go from insect eyes to this macro to micro structures of perceiving.
Wonderful.
Light.
Yeah. And I was always wondering about spiders because they have eyeballs pointed forward and backward. How do they perceive time? Because they're always moving away and towards things. It's I wonder how they perceive time. It might be very different from us.
Well, some eagles have eyes that can see virtually 360 degrees.
Yes. Yeah.
So how do you work that? How do you work that experience out? You can focus on things with that kind of vision, and also see the context in you know the equivalent of binaural vision.
Right.
Wow.
And speaking of the angel of history and going backwards on the Maori, I was snorkeling. I'm happy to tell you, I was snorkeling in Puerto Rico a week ago, and for the first time in my life, I'd seen cuttlefish, I'd seen octopuses, and I saw a great octopus, by the way, Andreas, in Puerto Rico. But I saw a little squadron of shrimp, you know, a squadron of them. And of course, they swim backwards. You know, their eyes are, the tentacles are at one end, the eyes are looking towards the tentacles, and they swim backwards. They're always looking at where they're, you know, where they came from. They're looking back at what's chasing them, basically. You know? Yeah.
Food for something.
Yeah, food for thought.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I don't want to cut anybody off if they have an urgent question, but and I want to point out, look, we have 2 more nights coming up, so please come back. Tomorrow we have Futuring and 2021, A Space Odyssey, and then on Friday night we're going to have Architecture of Scale. I have absolutely loved this. Really, really deep. I mean, you know, pulling out some of the knots and paradoxes relative to language and perception. I think it's extremely crucial. You know, I always tell my students, a bear, you know, we see a bear, oh, like, or we see a shrimp, oh, there's a bear, there's a bear. It's not a bear. I mean, we named it bear. And we can't separate that anymore from its fur, right? It's, you know, it's like it mingled with its fur. So I ask, how can we see, you know, the bear and the bear, you know, see both at the same time? The one that's a part of our solar system and the one that's a part of our language, and then we say, oh, there's a bear. Anyway, I think that's a hint, like the idea that you know, we're always experiencing and inhabiting forms of representation. Cognition itself, consciousness itself, is in an inhabitation of various forms of representation that are mingling with perception, you know, with the world around us. And I think that you've absolutely opened this up. The paradoxing is a great beginning to where I think we're heading in the next 2 nights. So I really want to thank the 3 of you.
Okay. Yeah, it was most enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael and Chris. And thank you for the audience and the questions. And hope to see you tomorrow on Friday.
Yes.
Definitely. Thanks for joining from Mykonos and from Scotland, from Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. You guys stayed up late. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Cheers.
See you
Bye-bye.
tomorrow.
Right. Bye.